Yes.
Okay. Thank you guys for joining us for our soil health webinar part 3. Today we're going to be focusing on cover crops, really diving into more of the specifics of cover crops, throwing together some mixes, looking at some specific scenarios. If you missed our previous recordings, they can be found on our website at ckcd.org. So I'm just going to do a quick rundown on what we do here at the Conservation District. So here at the Conservation District, we work with local private landowners to implement conservation practices to improve and conserve water quality and quantity, soil productivity, livestock health, air quality, plant health and vigor, as well as wildlife habitat. Typical projects with the Conservation District include riparian restoration work. We do fuels reduction for forest health, transitioning to alternate farming practices, livestock waste management, as well as much more. Additionally, we offer technical advice and assistance to landowners for a wide range of natural resource concerns. So if you would like to contact us, my contact information is there at the bottom. I'll also be sending out a follow-up email after the webinar, which will have my contact information, as well as the contact information for our presenters today. Also, CKCD and EKCD are developing soil health work groups to help guide our soil health initiative moving forward. So these work groups are going to have a number of responsibilities, participate in future soil health events, roundtable discussions regarding soil health, discuss funding opportunities for soil health projects, partaking in ranking of potential soil health projects, as well as disseminating information to the community regarding results of soil health projects. So if you're interested in joining a work group, please give us a call. We would love to hear from you. Couple of things about the webinar. There is a post-webinar survey. If you could please fill that out, we'd greatly appreciate it. Especially if you're interested in working with the district moving forward with a pilot project. There's a lot of specific questions about pilot projects and really diving into the specifics of what you're interested in doing on your land. Questions during the webinar, there's a Q&A spot at the bottom. Just post your questions there and we will address them after the presentations. Also, this webinar is funded by a system of rates and charges collected from landowners in Central Klickitat and Eastern Klickitat Conservation Districts. So we just want to say thank you for your contributions to conserve natural resources for the benefit of everyone in Klickitat County. And last but not least, thank you so much to our NRCS partners, both locally and nationally. And lastly, please stick around after the presentations and join us for a roundtable discussion on how we can make cover crops work here in Klickitat County. Like I said, we're really going to be diving into the specifics of cover crop mixes and looking into some specific situations, and folks will have a chance to speak up and talk about their specific situations. So I am going to go ahead and introduce our first presenter today. Let me stop screen sharing here. Justin Morris. So he's going to be focusing on integrating grazing into your rotation. So Justin Morris has been serving as Regional Soil Health Specialist for the Soil Health Division of the Natural Resource Conservation Service since October of 2015. He is based out of the Madison area of Wisconsin. Justin travels throughout the upper Midwest and even nationally to provide education and training on soil health while specializing in managed grazing. Prior to serving his current position, Justin served as a pasture specialist for NRCS in Western Montana, a rangeland specialist in Southwestern Montana and Southwestern Utah, a soil conservationist in Western Oregon, and as an agriculture extension agent in Northwest Montana. Thank you for being here with us today, Justin. You can go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Angel. Appreciate that introduction. Today, folks, I'm really happy to present some of this information to you. This is our third webinar, and a subject that is near and dear to my heart is grazing. And as Angel mentioned, I spent quite a bit of time as a rangeland specialist for NRCS in a couple of different states. And to me, whether we're talking permanent pasture or whether we're talking cropland, when animals are part of the equation, I would say a lot of wonderful things can happen really quickly, and we're gonna dive into that here a little bit, um, as well as we're going to um, look at how grazing cropland and permanent grassland can impact soil function as well as animal performance. We're going to get into a little bit on the principles of adaptive grazing management. And then we're going to also get into a little bit on some management strategies for grazing both cropland and permanent grassland. So first off, what may have taken some of you back a little bit or surprised you is talking about grazing cropland. And growing up in Washington State, my family and I, we lived for about half of our time on the west side of Washington State in the Puget Sound area. And then the other half of my growing up years I spent in central Washington. When I left Washington State and actually started traveling for college and going to other states, it really kind of surprised me a little bit when I started seeing cattle grazing cropland. And as you drive through, if any of you have ever driven through Nebraska in the wintertime, it can be quite a common sight to actually seeing cattle grazing corn stalks. And this was kind of a new thing for me because I'd never really considered animals as part of a cropland system or part of a rotation. But come to find out, as we dive down into it a little bit on what animals can actually do in a cropland setting, they can actually they can do what I call speed up biological time. And that's because the animals are essentially that primary source of nutrients for crop production, because they're helping to cycle those plant residues back to the land. And because the animals are able to essentially biologically accelerate time, they can actually have a positive impact on soil health because they're adding biology. When dung comes out of the back end of that animal, it's filled with bacteria. And then with their hoof impact, they're not only spreading some of that dung out, but then they're also knocking down quite a bit of vegetation with their hoofs, which then helps to give us a little bit more organic matter cover over the soil surface, and a portion of that can actually be broken down and assimilated by microorganisms to then make nutrients that were in that plant material available to the next wave of plants that'll be growing there. The other thing too is that, the animals can be an additional source of income where that income has normally not been realized. Putting animals on a cover crop, for example. And then the other thing too is that those animals can have an impact on increasing nutrient cycling. So as they are breaking down that or consuming that plant material, and as it's getting broken down by rumen microbes, what comes out is something that is usually a lot lower in that carbon and nitrogen ratio, which is something that the soil bacteria just absolutely love, and they can make good use of it very quickly. So some other advantages for grazing cropland would include things like increasing mycorrhizal fungi abundance. If you might remember from our prior conversations, mycorrhizal fungi are a good fungi that will actually create a symbiotic relationship, so a mutually beneficial relationship with plant roots. And those mycorrhizal fungi can actually can access nutrients in the soil to a much greater degree than plant roots can on their own without that mycorrhizal fungi association. So having mycorrhizal fungi in the soil is a good thing, and animals can actually help to enhance that. They can also help to enhance the building of soil aggregates. And those soil aggregates are really important for water to be able to get into your soil. They can also help with improving that water infiltration, as well as helping with remediating things like salinity. And also, since a cover crop would be grown there on the cropland for the animals to graze, or if they're grazing crop residues, it means that for every day that they're grazing that, they are not eating hay. Because as we know, anybody that has livestock, hay is a big expense. So anything that we can reduce that is a win-win.
Justin,
Justin,
we're not seeing your screen, Justin.
Oh, you're not. Okay, let's go back. How long has that been?
Well, I think just start from where you're at.
Okay, let me do that again. Okay. Okay.
There you go.
You guys are seeing it now?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So then some other things that livestock can do is they can actually have a beneficial effect on the diversity of insects. And as we increase that diversity, that can actually have a beneficial effect on reducing pest species. And also those animals can serve as a sink for agricultural byproducts. And they can encourage the establishment of perennial forages as the primary feedstuff for ruminant animals. So there are some challenges when we start looking at grazing cropland. It's not a simple thing to just put animals out there. Probably one of the biggest challenges that we have is the lack of knowledge with regards to livestock management, herd health considerations, and then also the equipment, the infrastructure that's needed, and how to use that equipment. A lot of people who, at least I will speak for row croppers out here in the upper Midwest. We have many row croppers that are just raising corn or soybeans, and they've never managed animals before. They've never managed livestock, and that's because the livestock left the farm 50 years ago. And when they left, then eventually the fences left, everything else that would be supporting and helping to sustain livestock, all that left. So that can be a big challenge. The other thing too is that, if there's going to be animals there, there's going to have to be an increased time spent managing those animals. The level of management is going to have to be higher because fence is going to have to be moved. The animals are going to need to be moved. Water is going to need to be checked on to make sure that they've got sufficient water. And then there's also the lack of infrastructure. So if that infrastructure is missing, if we don't have fence, if we don't have water, or if the fences are in really poor shape, it means that we're going to have to address those issues before animals can arrive. The other thing too is that a lot of crop farmers just raise crops. They don't have any livestock. And so if they're going to try to get access to livestock without owning the animals, then there's the complication of working out a lease agreement. with a livestock owner. There's risk if you have animals on cropland, and if the animals are not being moved frequently enough, you could get some compaction occurring on that cropland. And then also, if the fencing is inadequate, or if there's temporary fencing that has to be installed, that there's the potential liability for animals to be on the roads. And depending on what state you're in, I know like the state of Idaho, that one definitely favors ranchers. If a motorist hits an animal on the road, then it's the motorist's fault, not the ranchers. So there can, just depending on the state, and I don't know what Washington state law is as far as livestock being on roads, but there could be that potential issue. So I'm just going to cover just very briefly. I don't want to bore you to death with research, but in case you're wondering what kind of research has been out there that's talked about the impact of grazing cover crops on cropland from a soil health perspective, there has been a number of studies done in the upper Midwest and the Southeast. Here's just a small sampling of those grazing cover crops. They found that it actually helped to increase soil fertility, as well as organic carbon, inorganic carbon, and then actually the population of the microorganisms in the soil. They also found a study down in Georgia looked at the impact of grazing cover crops on soil physical structure, and found out that if the animals are moved frequently enough, being managed appropriately, that grazing of the cover crops does not cause any significant physical damage to the soil, that we can still maintain yield in our cropping system. Now, when it comes to grazing crop residues, there's been quite a bit of studies done in Iowa and Nebraska, and looking at impacts on the following cash crop yield. And both of those studies basically have shown that there's minimal to no reduction in cash crop yield following grazing crop residues from the prior winter. Some on-farm testing done in North Dakota. So this is not, replicated research trials, but this is just some on-farm testing. They looked at the impact of grazing cover crops along with no-till compared to farms without cover crops or no-till. And what they ended up finding is that the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium actually was increasing. And you're reading that right, you're hearing it right. That nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium was actually anywhere from 4 to 9 times higher, depending on what element you're talking about. It was higher where there was cover crops with no-till being grazed compared to farms without cover crops or no-till. The other thing too is that the organic matter levels were actually higher, and water infiltration was dramatically higher. Some research done in Texas looking at different levels of grazing management on permanent grasslands, so on perennial pasture. And some of you who have permanent pasture, you may have some dry pasture, you may have some rangeland. So this is something that might be of interest to you. The level of grazing management, and this was looking at heavy or light continuous grazing compared to a multi-paddock grazing system. They found that the multi-paddock grazing system actually provided better soil cover. It actually provided lower soil penetration resistance, lower sediment loss, more organic matter, greater cation exchange capacity, and an increased fungal population. So what are some advantages from grazing grasslands? for soil health. So some of those advantages would include things like we can actually improve the quantity and quality of forage for livestock from a perennial forage base. We can allow enough leaf area there. We can actually plan to leave enough leaf area so that we're protecting the soil, which is going to help to decrease evaporation and actually have a positive effect on increasing infiltration, as well as allowing plants to recover quicker. And it's going to also help to maintain or improve plant diversity. It can also help to decrease the need for mechanical harvest. And as I spoke about before, the cost for growing, harvesting, and feeding out hay can be one of the largest expenses on a livestock operation. So anything that we can do to reduce that would be wonderful. So if we manage our perennial pastures, our permanent pastures at a higher level, we can decrease that mechanical harvest. We can actually see a greater gain per acre. We can actually accelerate biology. We can improve soil health at a quicker rate because we're adding more biology. Every time that animal feels the call of nature and dung comes out, we're adding biology. We're also incorporating organic matter through the hoof impact of those animals. And we're going to be able to improve nutrient cycling. So, and one of the big benefits here is that this also makes it so that animals are eating a wide variety of plants. And the greater wide variety of plants that animals are eating, the more diverse their diet is, their health can also improve as a result. So this is looking here this is a study that was done down in Texas about 60 years ago or so. But this is basically looking at the relationship between how much is taken, if you start taking away more and more leaves above ground, how does that actually affect root growth? And as we've talked about in prior webinars, the roots are where soil biology are interfacing with the plant. So the more roots you can have that are actually growing and that are actually giving off those sugars, those amino acids, the better. So in this, just this quick little table just shows that, we can remove basically up to about 50% of the leaf area and have a minimal impact on root growth. But as we get upwards of 60%, 70%, 80%, then we start having a really dramatic impact on root growth, which is not a good thing. It's not to say that that someone couldn't remove 60 or 70% at just one instance in time. They could come back and maybe only be removing 30 or 40% later on to compensate for maybe some really severe grazing in the past. That can be done, but we just have to realize that when you on a perennial pasture, when you get over the 50% mark, you're really having an impact on root growth. So this is just showing what happens underneath. These plants, pretty much all cool season plants, but on the far left is a tall fescue plant, and under a good rotational system, and you can see you've got a couple feet above ground, you've got roots that are going down at least probably close to a foot, or actually probably a lot longer than that. But if the grazing management shifts to the point that animals are allowed to stay in an area for an extended period of time, to the point that every time that plant tries to regrow, there's an animal back on it, nipping on it, then what ends up happening is those roots underneath the plant actually start to shorten up. Well, when we get into a situation like that, not only are the plants, do you not get as much forage growth in a given year, but the plants are not as drought tolerant. So if the rain shuts off, if you've only got roots going down a couple inches and your rain shuts off, you're done. The other thing too is, what else are those roots getting besides access to water? Well, they're also getting minerals because they're interfacing with soil life. So it kind of stands to reason that those plants are not going to be providing as a nutritionally complete meal for those animals when you've got such short growth compared to plants with much longer root lengths. So when you overgraze the shoot, which is that above ground part, you end up overgrazing the root. This is looking at a rainfall simulator, which is just showing essentially the impact of grazing management on the water cycle. So where we've got animals lingering in one area for a long period of time, and you can see this with those two trays on the far right, that represents overgrazing of two different species of grass. So as animals linger in an area longer and longer and longer, you can see that when you get a rain event, or if this is irrigated pasture and you're irrigating, you want every drop of rainwater or irrigation water to soak into the soil. You do not want it to run off. The perception is that if it's as long as there's something green, that water is going in and everything's good. But as you can see from this rainfall simulator, that's not the case. In fact, you look at the runoff jugs, and the runoff jugs for the far right one is over half full, probably pushing close to 2/3 full. The runoff jug on the tray right next to it that says overgrazed species B is almost half full. And notice that it's not just water that's ending up there. It's water plus it's soil and anything else that's attached to that soil. If there's manure there or whatever, it's going to end up in that runoff. You look at if you look closely, you can see that there's some jugs underneath on those right two trays. The far right one has just a little bit of water in it. It's a lot clearer. The overgrazed species B tray has about the same amount of water, but it's darker. But that kind of goes to show you that, what's running off versus what's going in. And whether we're grazing cropland, whether we're grazing permanent pasture, anytime we get a rain event, we want that water to go in. We do not want it to run off. And the thing about it is, folks, is that this is totally reversed by grazing management. That's all it is. We're not talking about another input that you have to go to buy. We're talking about the difference between overgrazing and well-managed pastures. So if you look at the three trays on the left, where we've got better grazing management in place, look at the runoff jugs and then look at the infiltration jugs. And you can see that a lot more water is going in and a lot less water is coming off. So when we look at the carbon cycle and how that carbon is cycling through cropland and through perennial pasture, the carbon cycle is fairly simplistic when you just have plants in the mix and you don't have animals. So you've got CO2 in the atmosphere. The plants are taking up CO2. They're utilizing that to make sugars. They give off oxygen as part of that process. The roots are actually respiring CO2. The soil biology respires CO2. But the system is fairly simplistic and doesn't move very fast or cycle as fast compared to if we add animals to the system, livestock, then we actually get a lot more interaction and we actually have the opportunity to make a bigger impact on cycling carbon in the ecosystem. So the animals are able to, harvest that plant material. The rumen microbes are then able to unlock the nutrients that are in what the animals eat. And then those rumen microbes, a lot of what they release as a byproduct is methane, which is your CH4, your methane, which then eventually gets converted back to CO2. And that's a very natural process. You also have it going through the manure. And then what the manure, as it breaks down, it gets converted as to be part of soil organic matter. And then some of that soil organic matter at times is oxidized and returns as CO2. And then the cycle starts back all over again. So when we look at the nitrogen cycle, again, animals are a key part of that cycle. We know that there's a lot of nitrogen in urine and quite a bit of nitrogen in manure. But animals are eating that vegetation. The waste from them, from the dung, is then broken down by soil biology, and then that is then remade available to plants. So this here is just a quick little bar chart showing that if we're going to manage animals in a way that's going to benefit their performance so that they will gain well and do well, besides soil health, the amount of time that they spend in one area is really, really critical. So this one here is just looking at over a 7-day time period, and they wanted to look at the amount of forage that the animals were eating on a day-by-day basis as they stayed in the same spot. Interestingly enough, on day one, they ate the most. They ate about 4% of their total body weight. Then on day two, they ate a little bit less. Day three, they ate a little bit less than the prior day. And then all the way out to day 6, they continued eating less and less and less. And what I want to kind of draw your minds to here is that this is really no different than if I were to draw a parallel between all of us being locked in a room, kind of like animals being locked in on a pasture, and all the fresh food is provided on day one. And we don't get any more fresh food for a whole week. So if we were to track how much we were going to be eating on day one and track it every single day, our intake, our eating would pretty much parallel what we see here with animals. And this just goes to show that the fresher the food the animals have access to, the more they eat, right? The fresher your food is, the fresher my food is, that's going to stimulate more consumption. But the longer you keep them there, then it's just like, I don't want to eat this old stuff. Got to try to, get around this urine spot or this dung spot. They want to have fresh food. And so that same is true for animals. So when we look at a cover crop, then we have to ask ourselves the question is the entire cover crop, is the forage quality the same from the top to the bottom? And how are we going to manage these animals if we were to put them on a cover crop or even in a perennial pasture? And the answer is that the quality of the diet for the animals changes as the animals start at the top and move their way down. So at the top, the forage quality is the highest. So you'll see here, crude protein's 14%, TDN, which is a measurement of energy, is 63.5, and then the relative feed value is 149. Those are all very stellar numbers, very good numbers from an animal gain perspective. So if we kept animals in here for just a day, so if they were just basically getting this upper half or upper third, they're going to do very well and they're going to gain very well. If we have yearlings or if we have finishing animals, they're going to gain weight very, very rapidly. But as we get into the lower portions of the forage, whether we're talking a cover crop or a perennial pasture, then you're getting into stuff that is not as good. And that's because the fiber content's going up. The leaves in the lower part of the plant canopy are older leaves. They're more fibrous. They're not as photosynthetically active. They don't have as many sugars in them. And so that's why you see the energy levels dropping down. You see the crude protein levels dropping down. So the moral of the story is, if we bring animals in on cropland or if we're grazing perennial pasture, you want animals to get the ice cream. the very best of the best, which is basically like that upper third of the plant canopy, which is really important for animals that you want to put a lot of weight on in a hurry. So this kind of brings us into grazing systems and what a grazing system is really used for. So if we're going to try to capture the most on getting the greatest benefit for the soil and the greatest benefit for the animals, we got to look at the animals as a tool, and those animals can be utilized, just like with any tool, either to benefit the ecosystem or to degrade it. So any grazing system should provide three things. It should provide adequate nutrition. It should protect and feed the soil both above and below ground. And it should work within the social constraints, the labor constraints of whoever's managing the animals. But essentially, if we're trying to fast track our way to soil health, if we're trying to make those gains, those improvements in aggregate stability, in soil infiltration, in nutrient availability, whether we're talking cropland or whether we're talking permanent pasture, we need to look at how we can mimic nature as closely as possible. So when we look at what nature does a lot of disturbances, and they come in a variety of different ways. So we look at things like, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, lightning strikes, wildfires. Those are all big disturbances. Things like, a volcano may only happen like once every 500 years. Earthquakes, depending on where you're at, can happen, quite frequently. Tornadoes and hurricanes, fortunately where you guys are in Washington State, you don't have to worry about hurricanes. At least. I have seen some pretty good dust devils in Eastern Washington. In fact, I think Spokane's had a tornado or two in the past. But generally, these things only occur once in a great while. They don't occur on a consistent, ongoing basis. And even like, for example, if you have a wild herd of herbivores that's on migration, they're not passing through the same area every single year, because generally their range is over a very, very large area. So they may only impact the same area maybe once every 3, 5, 10 years. So if we look at these disturbances, you could break them down into 3 different dimensions. There's the timing dimension, there's the frequency dimension, and then there's the intensity dimension. The natural disturbance patterns that stimulate major ecological change generally exhibit a variable timing, a fairly low frequency, and a fairly high intensity. So when we look at major changes happening on the landscape, it seems that these types of disturbances follow this similar pattern. So this kind of enters into what we would kind of call something like natural disturbance grazing. How does nature do this? So essentially, we're talking about mimicking what nature does under changing environmental conditions. We're trying to mimic those disturbance patterns while environmental conditions are in flux. So that means the timing has to be variable. So that means the plants are grazed at different times of the year to facilitate pasture diversity. And this would apply more to permanent pasture than it would to grazing a cover crop on cropland. The frequency is going to be fairly low, which means that plants are going to be grazed a few times per year to ensure that the plants get fully recovered after they've been grazed. And the intensity is going to be pretty high, meaning that the animals are going to be congregated fairly close to each other so that most of the plants are pretty much all getting grazed. It isn't just that a specific species of plants getting eaten, but they're kind of all getting nibbled on. And you're also going to get a high degree of trampling because the animals are actually fairly close to one another. But that can actually, as long as you've got enough plant material there, whether we're talking cropland with a cover crop or we're talking permanent pasture, that trampling effect can actually be very beneficial. And also that grazing duration is going to be fairly short, so that we don't want desirable plants like in a permanent pasture to be regrazed over and over and over again before they have a chance to recover. So when we look at continuous grazing is a biological disturbance that can result in poor soil health, and that's because the timing is unchanging. When we have animals out there, they're out there in the same spot for a month or two, maybe even longer. So what's happening is those plants are they're getting grazed basically at the same time of the year every year. The frequency is fairly high, and it's because every 7 to 9 days, the animals are coming right back and they're nibbling on any regrowth that may have occurred. And the intensity is fairly low. So pretty much all the plants are grazed down very short, or the plants grazed very short have alongside them ungrazed plants in the same field. So you'll see kind of like this kind of a bipolar arrangement or a binary arrangement where you've got plants that are grazed down to the nubbins, and then you'll have stuff that's 2-3 feet tall that's all headed out. It's got a seed head on it, and the animals won't touch it for anything because it's rank, it's fibrous, it's stemmy, and they don't want to touch that. So the thing about it is with continuous grazing is that it doesn't require any management skill to be able to do that. You got an area and you just kick the animals out there and you just let them do their thing. Now I'm going to contrast here with something that is what we call adaptive grazing management. And this is where we're basically using a feedback loop to figure out whether our grazing management is on track or not. So the feedback system has to fit the ecosystem. It needs to be flexible. Adaptive grazing management is not a specific grazing system. It can be a blend of different grazing methodologies or grazing strategies. At some times of the year, it can be very, very intense. Other times of the year, it can be a little bit more relaxed. But one of the things with a more of adaptive grazing management approach is that it's the manager or whoever is managing the animals is constantly observing those animals, and it's more of a hands-on type system. So that manager is observing what's happening in the pasture. They're observing how much vegetation is being taken. They're observing the animal's behavior, the manure consistency that's coming out the back end, and then they are then making changes on the fly to figure out, okay, do we need to, speed up the animals as they're rotating through? Do we need to slow them down? Do we need to hold them in another area while this other vegetation regrows? The nice thing about this more adaptive approach is it minimizes the risk associated with unforeseen changes. So, for example, if I'm moving animals like every 30 days and I go out there after 30 days and I'm like, oh my goodness, they really took this down hard, a lot harder than what I wanted them to. Compare that to, well, if I was moving animals maybe every 5 days, then I'm usually, for a 5-day allocation, it's going to be a lot smaller area than a 30-day allocation. And because of it being more of a smaller allocation, I'm going to want to be out there more frequently monitoring to see how things are going on. And in this way, it makes it so that if something unforeseen happens, I can usually adapt very quickly and make a change. If I go out there after 3 days and I see, wow, they've taken enough here, I need to move them on. Then if you were out there just observing every single day, you can make that change. So that's really important. Another thing along with this is that adaptive grazing management, which is going to be more of this high intensity, low frequency grazing that you're going to kind of see more on the right. That's going to, have a much better impact on the land. And it's going to allow you to start to capitalize on those advantages. And as we're talking about grazing cropland, grazing cover crops, we're definitely going to be getting more into this realm of more of a high intensity, low frequency type grazing setup. Compared to, a typical rotational system, you see here that what looks like to be like a clock. There's only 3/4 of the area, 75% is resting while 25% is being grazed. So that's basically like a 4-pasture system. And while that's okay, we can do a lot better with the one on the right. The one on the right, if you're using more of an adaptive approach, you're generally going to be splitting those fields down into much smaller subunits. It's where you've got grazing occurring on only about 5% of the area, and 95% is actually in recovery mode. So here we're kind of comparing continuous grazing versus the typical rotational grazing, and then what we call the high intensity, low frequency grazing setup. And in continuous grazing, you see where all the manure is being deposited, right? It's near the stock water tank. And then it just gets less and less and less as you move away from the tank. Now, if we take that field and we chop it up 4 ways, and we put all the water there where those 4 pastures actually touch, then you get most of the manure concentrated at the very center, and then it radiates outward. But in more of the high intensity, low frequency grazing setup, notice that, in this case, the animals are actually being moved every day. And one of the great benefits from that is that you get, rather than just a hot spot of manure or urine in certain areas, you're actually getting manure and urine being thoroughly distributed over the entire field. Corner to corner, it doesn't matter how close you are to the water tank or not. Those animals are essentially distributing all those nutrients more uniformly than any manure spreader could. So some principles of grazing management when we're talking about to improve soil health, we have to be able to feed the animals, right? So no one's going to starve their way to profitability when feeding livestock. We want to reduce the animal's ability to select so that we can improve the desirable plants, increase the population of desirable plants to improve pasture diversity, which would be more of a permanent pasture consideration, not necessarily a cover crop situation. We want to leave leaves for photosynthesis and cover. So we don't want bare ground when the animals leave. That's enemy number 1 is bare ground. We want to leave plenty of leaves for photosynthesis and cover. We want to have enough of a recovery period so that plants can actually regrow. And we want to plan out our grazing timing, our frequency, and intensity. So we want to be intentional about where we are with the animals and how they're being managed. So with sufficient plant recovery, you can go from what's on the left to what's on the right with sufficient recovery. And that's all with grazing management. All with grazing management. Haying is another disturbance that can result in poor soil health. Their haying can actually have a negative effect on aggregate stability. And if you look at the soil cores on the right, the one on the left is the native rangeland, the one on the right is the hayfield, and you look at how that color, the darker the color and the deeper it's going, that means we're getting, more carbon further down into the soil profile. and we have a greater carbon concentration with that darker color. And if we look at something like aggregate stability, which I think is probably one of your best measurements for soil health, where you've got a good grazing management taking place, here on our native rangeland, we have very good aggregate stability, 80% at the soil surface, which is going to help with infiltrating water. Compared to the hayland, the aggregate stability is only 20%, so that when we get that rain, if we don't have good stable aggregates, what's going to happen to that rain when it hits the soil surface? Well, those first few raindrops are going to basically melt those aggregates, and all the surface pores in your soil are going to get plugged up to the point that water is not going to want to infiltrate. It's going to start running off. And now that was a lost opportunity from a plant growth perspective. When we look at water infiltration rate, again, where we've got good, healthy pasture on our left, an infiltration rate of 27 inches per hour is I almost have a hard time even visualizing that, compared to hayland, which is just around 0.6 of an inch per hour. Again, that comes from that difference in surface aggregate stability. So when we look at management strategies for grassland, here is essentially like a 16 paddock system with water at the center of 4 paddocks. The animals are moving through the system, and they're going through in a numerical fashion. So here, if we were to chart how much forage is actually there, the most forage is in paddock 1. And then the next most is in paddock 2, on all the way to paddock 16. So this red line is basically the line of that's how much forage we want to leave in the pasture when the animals exit the pasture. So any of the column that's above the red line is stuff that we say is, okay, we can go ahead and utilize that. And so as animals go through their first graze, it can be almost a stair-step fashion. But on the second graze going through the growing season really needs to be based on how ready the pastures are. So even though you may have gone through the first round in a numerical fashion, the second graze, because of differences in soil type, variations in the vegetation from paddock to paddock, we need to be adaptable in our management to realize that maybe we start in paddock 2 instead of paddock 1. And we go from paddock 2 to paddock 1 to paddock 3. Maybe we jump to paddock 5, and then we go back to paddock 4. So what I'm just trying to say here is that it's almost impossible to write a grazing plan several years in advance that's going to tell exactly which direction, which fields to go into, movement by movement. But that's where we need to be adaptable in our management and be monitoring how things are regrowing in these fields so that we know where to move animals and when. So some other soil health improvement strategies are things like bale grazing, which can be very beneficial, especially in the wintertime. There's a number of producers that this was actually kind of started up in Canada, where they get a pretty good winter up there. But they use the bale grazing actually to start improve getting more organic matter onto their soil. And so they allow the animals to graze those bales. They use hot wire to meter how much access they have to the number of bales. And that can actually, if you look at this picture on the right, I mean, there's a lot of residue, there's a lot of manure. You kind of see like these circles out there. But in 2 to 3 years, you won't even see any of this residue. This residue will be gone. And in the place of all this residue, you have even greater forage productivity in those areas because you're adding so much more nutrients back to that land. Here's some equipment that you can use. When we start talking about managing animals on a more frequent basis, it's really important for things to be portable. So on your upper left is a mineral tub on tires that you can pull with an ATV. On the bottom left is poly braid, which is a type of a poly wire that's actually braided so that it's more durable. And then you wind up that poly braid onto this geared reel that you see in the center. And that way you can wind up a fence really, really fast. In the upper right is a homemade rack for holding step-in posts to be able to manage the animals on whether we're talking cropland or permanent pasture. And then in the bottom right is actually an automated gate timer that allows you to set up multiple paddocks in advance. And then you can set that timer to release the coil spring gate that it's attached to so that the animals can actually admit themselves into the next sequence of paddocks without you physically having to be there. So here's some more portable equipment when it comes to delivering water to animals. Here's kind of the upper left, your run-of-the-mill Rubbermaid 50-gallon stock tank. Here's another one on the upper right made out of stainless steel that you can pull behind an ATV as well. And then in the bottom is basically a quick connect coupling system with an above ground watering infrastructure on cropland. And this is a pretty interesting system because if I've got cropland, I don't want to have to worry about running into water lines or running into stock tanks or running into a bunch of fencing out there. I've got a combine with a 20-foot header on it. I've got, wide equipment. And so I don't want to have to worry about damaging anything out there. And that's why when we're talking about grazing cover crops, then we're really talking about having even portable watering infrastructure, portable water lines, so that all these water lines can go away, they can be rolled up and they can be moved on to another field or stored away for later use. And that way, as equipment is going through there during the cropping period, we don't have to worry about running into anything. So a little bit on cover crop selection. Generally for feeding livestock, mixtures of plant species is going to provide higher production and quality versus a single species planting. I wouldn't recommend a single, a double, or even really a triple species mix. I like to actually see mixes that start off at least probably 8. And I've seen mixes upwards of, there's some people that do 12, 13 way mixes. But from a soil health perspective and from an animal health perspective, a mixture of a blend of cool and warm season grasses and legumes is going to be better than a single species planting at any time. Warm season mixes, generally they're low in protein, but higher yielding. Cool season mixes are generally higher in protein, but also are lower yielding. We want to limit some plant species in the mix if we've got them, like if it's canola or if it's brassicas, we generally want to limit those to just a percentage of the mix. We don't want them to be dominant. We would like to have quite a few grasses in there. For cattle, if cattle are going to be grazing a cover crop, then we want grasses to be either the dominant or the co-dominant. Herbicides are another thing that we got to consider. So if we use herbicides on a cash crop prior to the planting of a cover crop, you need to look at the label on the herbicide to see what the plant back restriction is for planting a cover crop that may have the same functional group. When I say functional group, if you're trying to control broadleaf weeds in a wheat crop, then if you've got broadleaf plants, like all your legume species, if you've got cowpeas in there, if you've got red clover in there, then you need to look at what the plant back restrictions are with that herbicide so that if you do decide to plant a cover crop, that you know that the broadleaf plants in the cover crop mix are going to survive. They're going to grow. The other thing too is also realizing that there can be residuals on those cover crops. There's also a lot of times the herbicides can show that if the cover crop is being used for forage, that what's the minimum amount of time that needs to happen between when the herbicide was sprayed on the cash crop and when the cover crop was being grazed for forage. So if we've got legumes in the mix, and this is more of an issue, especially if we've got a pure stand of legumes, which I wouldn't recommend. But if we've got a high amount of legumes in the mix, we don't want to introduce hungry animals onto the field. We want to introduce them very slowly. We want to provide a lot of dry matter, and that can be simply done by leaving a round bale of hay where they can get access to it. So if they're grazing something really lush, very vegetative, it's good to have a little bit of dry hay there for them to be able to kind of increase the fiber content of what they're eating. So we want at least 25% grasses in the cover crop mix. Strip grazing would be the best way to utilize it, rather than just turning the animals out into a 100-acre field and letting them just have it all at once. We want to meter that out. We want to ration that out, because we're going to get way better utilization on it. We're going to get the more thorough manure and urine distribution over the whole field. And the animals are going to eat a little bit on every plant in front of them, instead of just preferentially eating just one plant or two plants. So as we're going into moving along in the 21st century, and it's hard to believe that a fifth of the 21st century is actually already passed. But what we want to do is we want to optimize disturbance. We want to optimize our soil cover. We want to maximize our biodiversity, and we want to maximize our living roots. Those are the principles that we want to live by. And these principles work whether we're talking grazing a cover crop or we're talking grazing permanent pasture. That's what we want to do. So with that, I will end. I'm a little bit over time. Sorry about that, Marlon. I guess I owe you an Impossible Burger.
Well, yeah. Sit there.
But I'll turn it back over to Angel here real quick.
I can or I cannot. I mean, it doesn't matter.
Angel here. Hey, Terry, I think that you are unmuted, and I think we might hear some background noise on your end, possibly. Just wanted to give you a heads up on that.
No, you can stay there.
So thank you so much, Justin, for your presentation. That was very comprehensive, and I think it's really relevant to trying to implement cover crops in our area, because I really think that grazing is going to be beneficial when it comes to cover crops on dry land, at least from the studies that I have looked into. So thank you for that. I think that we're going to take a couple minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions for Justin, they can go ahead and post them in the Q&A. So we'll just take a couple minutes for any questions or comments, or if you want to maybe bring up your specific situation and we can talk about some things there.
Well, someone's got to have a question. We can't proceed unless there's at least one question.
Gotta have a question.
Angel, there's a question in the chat column from Will. Did that question get answered earlier? About the
Let's see
overgrazing on the hay?
here. Did you see that one, Justin?
I'm not seeing the chat. Let me see if I can look at it real quick.
I can go ahead and read it here. So his question is, how does overgrazing talk apply to hay production where you are taking 90% of the leaf in a cutting?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we covered we covered a little bit there about how, from a soil health perspective, how haying can be quite disturbing. And what one thing I would just say is that you know, a lot of times with, and if we're talking irrigated hayland, I mean, that hayland may be cut every, you know, 30 days, 35 days. If it's dry hayland, I mean, that may only just be a once a year type cut. But what I would really focus on is leaving as much cover as we can. Most cutter bars that I'm familiar with are usually set at around 2-inch. Because in haying, we want to get maximum tonnage, right? It's all about getting maximum tonnage. But I think oftentimes what's missed is that, you know, where you do remove 90%, how much bare ground is showing up after the swather goes through and it's baled off? Most alfalfa fields that I've been on that are hayed, you know, like under a center pivot, I mean, there's like probably, you know, 80% bare ground, because all you have is these little short stubbles. There's just these little stems that are sticking up, and you don't have really much of anything else covering the soil surface. So what I would say is, number one, for hay ground, I would try to raise up the cutter bar height. If I could put skids under the cutter bar to get my cutter bar up height, usually most cutter bars will hydraulically adjust to something greater than 2 inches. You can usually get skids to go under the cutter bar to raise it up even more. Now, what that'll do is that does cut back on yield initially, and you know, while everything revolves around yield, there's also this element of quality. So when you make a windrow, the closer that windrow is sitting to the soil surface, the longer it takes to dry out. And when you go to rake it, and especially if you use like a pull type wheel rake, those wheel rakes have to make contact with the ground in order to function. So when you're trying to make a windrow, you can pull up a lot of soil and everything, rocks and stuff like that, which will then contaminate the windrow. So if you have a way of maintaining a little bit higher cutter bar height, I mean, if I could get 4 inches on my cutter bar height, I would try to do that, because that's going to help provide more soil cover, help to reduce evaporation somewhat. And then I can also end up with a windrow, because that windrow sitting on taller stubble, that windrow the air will recirculate around the underside of it a little bit better. So I get a little bit better dry down on it. And it'll be a cleaner product because it's not sitting right there close to the soil surface. And if I'm using like a rotary rake that's PTO or hydraulically powered, that doesn't require making contact with the soil, with the ground surface, in order to collect and merge and make a swath, then I would try to do that as well. So I look at a combination of increasing cutter bar height so that you can actually get more soil cover, and also be able to get a cleaner, higher quality hay product as a result from it. And then I would also look at, if I've got just an alfalfa monoculture that I'm haying, I would try to look at getting some grasses in there, getting some other diversity in there besides that, because then that'll help to start taking up more and more of the bare soil space, so that when you do cut, you still got other plant types that are providing different levels of leaf cover that can still be there to still provide some cover even after the mower has gone through.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Hopefully that answered your question, Will. If there's no other questions, I guess we will continue with the webinar. And if any questions pop up, just feel free to put them in the Q&A section at any time. There will be more time to address those questions later on. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to share a couple of videos with you guys of a couple of folks who are doing cover crops over in Wasco County. One of them is Noah Williams and the other one is David Brewer. So they only receive about 10 to 14 inches of rainfall over there. So it's pretty similar to what we get over on this side. Let's go ahead and share my screen with you, and hopefully the video quality is okay and hopefully you guys can hear it. Let me know if you guys cannot hear it, please. So this one is on Noah Williams.
Hi, my name's Noah Williams. I've been farming since about 1997, and about 2001 I started on my own. I own 905 acres here, but I farm roughly 2,800 acres in a fallow rotation. My main crop that I grow is winter wheat. I do grow a little bit of spring barley on occasion. Really like the conservation side of the farming. I've really gotten more interested in it over the years, especially as I get older and I think of what I need to do to hand this down to the next generation. I don't want everything depleted. I want things sustainable, and I know it can be done. And I know with the cover cropping, I've been told it can't work in our area, but I believe it can. It's just, we're not gonna be able to do it how the Midwest does it. We're in a different rainfall area. We get our rains in the wintertime. It is possible for us to do it. It's just, we have to change our mindset. We have to look, put maybe some blinders on, not listen to the naysayers, and just do it and try to find out what works for us.
We're working with Noah Williams on all kinds of conservation projects, but particularly ones that involve soil health. And some of the things that Noah Williams has been particularly interested in is implementing cover crops on his operation. I helped Noah to install the sensors in his project. We have one set of sensors in the cover crop and one set of sensors in the chemical fallow so that we can compare our results of soil moisture between the two different trials.
I always like being told I can't do something, because that gives me determination enough to prove people wrong. So by using the soil moisture sensors, I can prove that it doesn't take all the moisture out of the ground.
The expectation is that we will gain a better insight about what's going on in the soil, specifically about what's going on in the soil during fallow and during cover crops. The information that we need to know is, can we effectively use cover crops as a replacement of fallow in our cropping rotation? And if so, when do we need to terminate cover crops so that we don't inhibit our yield potential for the consequent cash crop?
I think managing the cover crops with cows is probably the best way to do it, because you're able to get nutrients, fertilization from the cattle. When the control in the cover crop, we knew exactly when they were almost identical. And what we're already seeing is every time we got a rain event, the cover crop actually picked up moisture in the deep root zone, where the control does not. The control never picks up moisture in the 2-foot zone. And in 2 feet, that's your battery. That's where you're storing. But every time we have a stress event, the control doesn't handle the stress, and the cover crop handles the stress. To me, that's a win. I think, okay, I'm changing things. I'm actually changing the normality of how we usually have seen things. If I wouldn't have had a cover crop there, the whole field would have stressed. Now that I had a cover crop there, that ground is healthier. It's able to let the roots handle the stress, and it's probably retained more moisture over the wintertime. There is basically cattle underneath the ground. That's the mycorrhizal fungi. There would be like a herd of cattle underneath the ground, but you got to feed them. If you don't feed them, they're not going to make anything for you under the ground. By doing this, I'm learning something. I have numbers. I can tweak it. Okay, I went too long with this cover crop. Okay, I went too short. You've always got to play with it, because you got to play with it with Mother Nature, because if it doesn't rain, then you got to cut it short. If it rains a lot, okay, I can extend that out a little bit longer, because I can keep that root growing in the ground and keep the soil healthy. I didn't spend any money on fertilizer. Yeah, it cost me $23, $25 an acre to seed it. but I didn't spend any money on fertilizer. I didn't lose any money. And as long as my yield isn't just horrible, I made money. Because that's the thing with the cover crops you got to look at. It's not short-term gain, it's long-term gain. If it takes me 10 years worth of cover crops and I can farm for 20 years longer without depleting my soils, that's benefit to me. That to me is money.
My name is David Brewer. I'm fifth generation in the family to manage this operation. It was founded in 1883. We raise mostly wheat, cattle, barley, canola, mustard are the crops that we predominantly raise. A variety of forage crops for the cattle. We finish all of our cattle here on the ranch, so we don't ship them off to feedlots anyplace. So we currently we're grass finishing everything and direct marketing them or selling them to grocery stores in Portland. I think, to me, there's more incentive almost to do the direct seed in the low rainfall environment because you just don't have the water to give away, and certainly in this case, we don't have the soil to give away. But I think in terms of low rainfall, there's just as much to gain from a productivity standpoint by keeping that soil undisturbed and the residue on top of the soil. And like everything else, attitude is everything. If you think it'll work, you'll figure out how to make it work. If you don't think it'll work, it probably won't work for you. So we don't have to get it to maturity, right? We don't have to ask it to produce seed for us. We just have to ask it to grow and feed the soil, put some roots down. So that just opens up some options. We've known for a long time that if we can raise a forage crop, you don't have to run it through the combine. You can bring cows to it, and cows will come a long ways to find good feed, right? I certainly don't want to be the guy that doesn't give the sixth generation the opportunity. So that's important. But I think that we're trying to look at it from a long-term perspective, and rather than just what's going to generate the most revenue next year, we're trying to just make sure that we're constantly improving the resource here and making sure that there's a better opportunity for the next generation. And I think as long as we keep focused on doing the right thing for the soil, for the land, then it'll all come out in the end. So.
All right, so if you're planning on implementing cover crops or if you're just toggling around with the idea, I really hope that those videos give you a little bit of inspiration and just kind of opened you up to the fact that it can work. It's just a matter of kind of shifting our mindsets from it can't work to how can we make this work here in our area. Marlon and Justin, did you guys have any comments on the videos that we just showed?
I loved in Noah's to see the diversity he had. He had three of the 4 plant groups growing in on his farm. I didn't see the warm season grasses because he probably planted when the moisture was available. But the other thing I loved about Noah's was he was planting beardless triticale. So a crop that doesn't have the awns or the beards on the crop. That's pretty important if you're going to graze cover crops, not to have that trait being expressed.
I liked seeing, both Noah and David, are both integrating animals, livestock into their cropping system. So it isn't that, they've just got maybe some permanent pasture that they just keep the animals on, but they're actually, trying to integrate those animals even to their cropping system so that they're getting that benefit for soil health. So I thought that was pretty significant. I also realized that looking at the backdrop on Noah Williams, he's right there close to the Columbia River. I mean, it looks like he's like maybe a mile or two south of I-84. So, and then it looked like David was just a little bit further south than him. So no doubt, you know, both these guys probably have their own internal support network and probably talk quite a bit to each other. And I think as we move forward, it's important that we develop those relationships and kind of develop that internal support structure, because you know, the journey down this road doesn't have to be by yourself. It can be, you know, being able to be in communication with somebody who's already started to forge that path.
Absolutely, Justin. I agree. And I was thinking about that moving forward. If we're going to have some more folks who are interested in doing cover crops, if we're going to be doing pilot projects and whatnot, and with the soil health work groups, it would be great to have some kind of platform for all of these folks to come together and kind of post ideas, concerns, what's working for them, what's not working for them, talk about their mixes, varieties and whatnot. Whether it's just like a Google Drive doc or something like that, for folks to share information and communicate amongst one another, because I do think that that's definitely really important moving forward with this. So I think that I don't see any questions or anything. Again, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A and we will address those. And we'll have time at the end as well. But we will go ahead and get right into Marlon's presentation. So he's going to be focusing on cover crop mixes and timing. So just to give a little brief intro on Marlon, Marlon earned his bachelor's and master's degrees at Utah State University in plant science. He grew up on a family-owned dairy farm in Dayton, Idaho, where he found his passion for life, agriculture. Marlon worked as a county agricultural agent for Utah State University Extension Service for 9 years in Price, Utah. He's been working for the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service for about 12 years as an area agronomist in northern Utah and state agronomist in Idaho. Marlon currently works as the regional soil health specialist for Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Marlon and his family live on a ranchette in Casper, Wyoming, where the family raises pasture, sheep, hogs, a few calves, and a large garden. All right, Marlon, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, and to the Conservation District. I have about a 30-minute presentation prepared. I'm going to spend 10 minutes on a review of cover crops and then go into making the cover crop mixes. So I currently live in Casper, Wyoming, and the bottom left picture shows a dry year when we're having the field days. And why would any rancher come out to a cover crop field day when it was a drought year disaster? Well, we still learn from each other during the dry year. The center picture was an above ground or above average precip year, and it was hugely successful. Big Jake in the red shirt, that was his first year. We said, oh man, you hit the perfect year to start with, an above average year. Some of the other guys were in it for 2 years in a kind of a drought period before things worked for them. I love this picture from the rancher that's telling the veterinarian. And then this morning, I suddenly noticed she didn't look so good. And you know, the farmer just wants a shot of LA-200 or some kind of antibiotic to get that cow going. But we all know that unless that rancher or farmer changes the management that he's doing with that cow, a shot of penicillin is not going to help. And so I love Justin's talk as he encourages us to consider improving our management on our farming operations. Just like that cow, our farmland can have some challenges. And another shot of the newest fertilizer isn't going to change how that soil functions. And so we need to address and identify these resource concerns. And I gave some of these slides in last month's talk, but those resource concerns could be providing crop diversity, armoring the soil, building soil aggregates, because if you don't have good stable aggregates, you don't get water infiltration. You can improve on pest management. You can build organic matter, nutrient cycling, improve air quality. You can provide pollinator and predator habitat. You can adjust your carbon to nitrogen ratios. 10 years of continuous wheat is going to build up pretty high carbon levels, but it's going to be tough for those organisms to break it down if you don't have a good carbon to nitrogen ratio somewhere in your crop rotation. You can support wildlife, food, and shelter. Justin talked a lot about livestock integration or nitrogen fixation. So these are all things that we can do to address our resource concerns and start to improve the health of our cow or improve the health of our soil. Why diverse cover crop mixes? Because if soil health is your goal, crop diversity can't be ignored or overstated. If you go out in nature, you'll see that plants were created to grow in diverse ecosystems. And Mother Nature is resilient because she builds diversity. She is not in a monoculture system. Now, I love a Dr. Pepper and an apple fritter, but my doctor keeps telling me, Marlon, you need to have a balanced diet. And our soil needs a balanced diet, because even good things like peas and turnips, they're awesome, but we need to use them in a moderated balance, or it can be harmful. Because if you plant a wrong cover crop mix and you have no carbon in your system or residue in your system, you'll have a bare naked, thirsty, hungry, running a fever soil. 4 things to talk about when you're working to plan a cover crop mix. What are your goals and resource concerns? We just covered that a few minutes ago. What are the environmentals, your climate, rainfall, frost, growing season considerations? What's the time frame? When are you going to plant this cover crop in your farming system? And your wife's going to want to know what's the budget. Generally speaking, the more specific your goals and concerns, the less diverse your cover crop mix will be. Number 2, the tighter your planting window, the fewer species will work, and thus the less diverse your mixes will be. We've asked a lot of these practitioners of the soil health innovators how long they felt they needed cover crops to grow before they started achieving a lot of their benefits. And their answer to me was 6 to 8 weeks. And you think about that, and Noah talked a little bit about this, fallow land versus cover crop land. Look at how long that cover crop land has photosynthesis occurring compared to that fallow land. I shown you this table last month. This is the Wyoming NRCS soil health periodic table. Cool season grasses on the left, warm season grasses like corn and millets and sorghums on the right. So you got to know that when you're making a mix, the warm season species can't be planted in the month of April, right? Because the ground's too cold to germinate. If they do germinate, it'll probably frost kill them out. So you have to understand your species in your mix and get to know them a little better. Justin talked about the 4 principles of soil health. These principles are universal, but how you implement them to your operation is unique. Each operation, as I visit across the Western US, their operation is unique and their approach to cover crops may be different. And I've been on hundreds of operations in the last decade or so, but the principles, they are universal, but everybody implements them a little different. For you cowboys out there that are feeding cover crops, we reviewed this chart quickly. This is a cover crop mix, and then they separated each species. And if you look at pearl millet in the center, the top half of the plant based on weight, so they put the cover crop over his hand to balance it and then cut it in half. The top half had 9.77% crude protein. Pearl millet had 1.77. And Justin kind of spent a little time on this, so I won't belabor it. Yellow sweet clover had 24.5% protein in the top half, 12%, 12.6% in the bottom half. So anyway, pretty cool mix. The interesting thing, then they took the top half of the whole mix and sent it in together, and it had a relative feed value of 208 and a protein content of 26.7. Did this guy need any protein lick blocks or protein supplement to feed his cows through the winter? I don't think so. Okay, I am going to see if I can bring up this cover crop mix. Angel, you can see my Excel spreadsheet, is that correct?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, so this is what we call a cover crop calculator, if you want to say it that way. I built it for Idaho. New Mexico uses it. Wyoming uses it. And after I do a couple of mixes, I do want to show you the world's best cover crop calculator in the world, in my opinion. So this is kind of an NRCS job sheet. So we don't have as many resource concerns, but it is important as a producer to identify what you're trying to do so that you have that plan in focus. So is there anybody in the audience, maybe they could come off mute somehow if that's possible, and maybe that's possible, Angel. Does anybody want to help me out with making a mix? What time of year would you plant it? And give me a couple resource concerns very quickly.
I'm going to allow anybody to talk at this point, so I'm going to change the settings to that.
Okay. So guys, we could make a winter mix, a spring mix, or a warm season multi-species mix. If somebody's daring, so that I can build one for an example. Angel, are they off speaker?
Yes, they should be able to unmute themselves, and it looks like a couple of them have.
Speak up, guys, quick. They didn't give me very much time for this presentation.
Harry Vetch.
Okay, so do you want to build a spring mix or a summer mix?
Well, it'd be spring seeded if it's going to grow.
Okay, spring seeded. So we're looking on the left-hand side of that periodic chart. And so the gentleman already spouted out a few. So we have common vetch, hairy vetch, woolly pod vetch. For today's experiment demonstration, we just say hairy vetch. You may want to do a spring forage pea. So these are all legumes. And maybe we'll add one kind of a new one to experiment with, faba bean. So this cover crop calculator shares kind of an average number of 16,300 seeds per pound in vetch. You can see that faba bean and spring peas are large seeded, so they only have 2,000 to 3,000. They only have 2,000 to 3,000 seeds per pound. So then we go to the grasses, and if you got wheat in your rotation, you may not want wheat, you may not want cereal rye, but possibly we could put in a spring barley, and in Noah's situation, he put in a spring triticale. And what's important with these grasses is that the grasses be awnless, so that they don't give that lump jaw to your livestock if you're grazing it.
Marlon, really quick.
Go ahead.
Really quick, can we go back up to the top where you kind of talked about, again, can we go back up in there and kind of talk about, what your kind of goals and what your objectives are and what resource concerns you're trying to address? Because again, if I feel like if we don't do something like that, if we don't really have it, we wouldn't have a good direction of what kind of species we need to be picking out here, right?
Oh, okay. Yes, that's good. And you know what's interesting? When you build multi-species mixes, they will address almost every one of your resource concerns. If you only do a single species or two species, they won't address them. But a multi-species mix, you can almost check every resource concern you got.
Okay, so what would be a good one? So for the guys in the Goldendale area here, so like Mr. Badish and everybody, what would be a good one that you guys would be looking to do with wanting to have a mix? What kind of mix would you want to see out there? What would you really want to address? You know, erosion, soil health, organic matter, water quality. So what's some good stuff that you guys would like to see addressed if you guys were going to use cover crops on your farms?
Well, uses would be either spring seeded forage mix or winter or fall seeded winter forage mix for either haying or grazing, or getting into the companion idea with wheat rotation or something to go in the wheat rotation would probably be the two options. Unless you're irrigated, that seemingly to be about it. If you're irrigated, you could do a summer seeded something to, again, grow forage to either hay or graze. And I would assume those would be your scenarios to go after.
So how about on your farm? Do you want to try to increase soil organic matter?
Yes, organic matter infiltration rate.
Yes.
And
Stabilization.
yeah.
What was that last one? Stabilization of the soil?
Yes.
Yeah, so reduce erosion from wind and water. Almost every farm I go to in the West has a problem with soil compaction.
Infiltration rate, of course, but that
infiltration, right. A lot of guys want to help break pest cycles and disease cycles, because if you're continuous small grains, you don't break the cycle. So that's often a resource concern.
Well, so most of us here are doing a follow rotation, so that cycle is broken.
So it's broken with fallow, but you're just going back the same crop every other year, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so our guys in Idaho are the same way. 20 years of wheat, 18 years of barley, and pretty soon they got cereal cyst, nematode, and want to know now how to fix it. So it can be a challenge, because a fallow isn't really a new plant in the system. It's just a mechanism to starve things out, if you want to look at it that way. Okay, so there's a few purposes. So increasing soil health, organic matter. Another one that a lot of people want to do is add a little nitrogen to their system. So utilizing excessive nutrients or maximizing some new nutrients. And so instead of fertilizing these, we use legumes in our cover crop mixes.
Which I had a question that I don't know if you want to answer later or not, but with N fixing, I've heard how legumes can eventually produce enough N to supply the cash crop and the rest of the crop you're growing there. But I've also heard if you apply any commercial N, they won't nodulate because the commercial N is readily available. So how do you get from point A to point B? So
in our cover crop mixes, we generally don't apply any commercial fertilizer. And as our soil health builds and our soil habitat increases and becomes more stable, the microorganisms can start cycling more nutrients. Some of our guys that have been into soil health for a decade now are starting to plant clovers with their wheat in a no-till system, and they're picking clovers that are shorter growing, and then they may use stripper headers to pick off the seed heads off the wheat or barley, whatever they're growing. So you're right. If you add nitrogen fertilizer to these, the legumes will get lazy and they won't produce as much nodules. Remember when I think Noah was cutting one of the rhizobium nodules with his pocket knife and he was showing you that it was red? That's a rhizobium bacteria that is actively fixing atmospheric nitrogen into plant available nitrogen. So there's not very many options really in the cool season grasses. Some guys may do a forage oat or just an oat. That's another option. And of course, you don't got to worry about awnless oats. So if you're going to break compaction, there's kind of two types of compaction. There's shallow compaction that's lacking soil aggregation or that granular structure. And the grasses are the best at that. Some of these taprooted species in the brassica family, like turnips not so much, but radish, that's a variety called grazer radish if you can find it. Maybe kale is another. Oh, instead of kale, say again.
There was a picture shown of a white radish. What radish is that?
That can be any of the radishes, daikon, tillage, or grazer radish. There's about 20 different types of radishes on the market. The one thing about radishes, when you plant them early in the springtime, the day length is short enough that they bolt and go to flower. And so when a radish goes to a flower, then they quit. Their life cycle is ending. And so this one grazer radish that we found in the list is a true biennial. So it doesn't flower the first year. So springtime is a little tougher on the radishes because they will bloom and not grow a great big root. But if you grow a radish maybe under an irrigated system and you plant it, the end of June, the 1st of July or August, they will not bolt because the day length is increased and is a longer. And so they stay as a vegetative and they grow that big, long radish root. Impact forage collards are a biennial, and so they don't throw seed the first year, so they stay vegetative. So turnips don't throw a seed head the first year, and so for supplemental grazing, those are good. But all three of them will have taproots, including the legumes. All broadleafs are considered to have taproots, but hairy vetch and peas, for example, are not very strong. Broadleaf category, we could plant black oil sunflower and maybe flax early in the spring, in the month of April. So there's a 5, 8, 10, 11, 12. So if this drives you crazy, then maybe you take off a faba bean. Most of the guys I work with aren't comfortable the first year making a 10-way mix. And if they're nervous, we come down to a 5 or 8-way mix. But we're trying to teach the principle of diversity in our systems. So last month we talked about planting rates, and on dry land, we plant about 30 pounds of seed to the acre, depending on the mix. Irrigated, we may go to 40. So the quickest way to build a cover crop mix, this is the Marlon Winger philosophy, everything gets a 1. And I'm almost done with my mix because I'm shooting for 30, but we got 11. So because I'm going to plant tillage radish and it's going to go to bloom, I'm probably only going to plant a half a pound of radish because I know they're going to go to bloom and they're not going to do as good for me as I think. Hairy vetch, I need some legumes, so I'm probably going to go 4 or 5 on that one. Spring pea 4, faba bean maybe 5.
Hey, Marlon,
Yes.
I don't know if this has been a concern in past mixes, but hairy vetch is actually listed as a poisonous plant to livestock.
So if you graze hairy vetch as a monoculture when it's producing seed, there's a little risk. But we've had no reports with the guys that are actually grazing hairy vetch in multi-species mixes with the concern. But if it's a monoculture mix of hairy vetch, when it's in the seed state, there is some issues with the seed content. But
Well, and what I was going to also add is that really when you drill down into it, all plants are toxic when you get them fed to a certain level. It doesn't matter what it is. If you get animals on a pure stand of something and that's all they're able to have, eventually it'll become toxic to animals.
yeah. So it's the same thing with Sudan grass. If it's a monoculture Sudan grass, you're probably going to have problems with prussic acid. But in multi-species mixes, we've had 0 problems with it in my experience. So good comment. But I am not personally scared of hairy vetch. I've been planting it for 20 years in mixes, and it's not an issue. So the only thing left we really got to do, we got 20 pounds in our mix. I love an oat because even if it gets mature, it still carries pretty good feed value. And so let me just see what putting 5 and 4 with these. Okay, so 4 pounds of barley, triticale, and 5 pounds of oats gives me about 30 pounds to the acre. And this column over here is seeds per acre. And so it's estimated at 727,000 seeds per acre. 100 pounds of winter wheat equals 1 million seeds per acre. So there's a Marlon Winger example of how I would build a spring seeded cover crop mix.
Question.
Now, go questions.
My concern is some of these seeds are good sized seeds. Do you need to have multiple seed boxes to seed a variety such as you have here?
Good question. It's a very common question. Yeah, if you have a drill that has an alfalfa box in it, you could put the small seeded species in it. But generally, we just mix them all together. And surprisingly, to me even, the cover crop seeds stay in solution because they have nearly the same density. And when I say that density, they have about the same bushel weight. For example, a bushel of turnip seed weighs 60 pounds per bushel. A bushel of wheat weighs how much per bushel?
60.
60. It's like son of a gun. Now, barley's a little less, 42, but collards are going to be right around 60. Sunflowers are going to be a little less, maybe the high 30s. But for the most part, they range from 30 to 60 pounds per bushel. And when you put them in a drill and they're all mixed up, they stay in solution pretty well. Because you would think that, oh, the turnips and collards are all going to fall out of the drill in the first 5 acres, right? But you'll see turnips and collards throughout the whole field. Same thing with black oil sunflower. So good question. But generally, we just mix them all together.
Setting a drill for seeding rate. I mean, we're used to setting it for either barley or wheat. And then how do you do it with all these other species involved?
Well, good question. So when you open up your lid, there should be a little line that says Marlon Winger's cover crop mix. Does yours not have that?
No, unfortunately not.
Unfortunately not. Son of a gun. So we worked with the Plant Materials Center in Aberdeen, Idaho, and we made a little Excel spreadsheet to help you with that. So our total mix per acre was 30 pounds to the acre, right? That's what we were shooting for. And in this example, our John Deere planter was 15 feet. We're going to do a test run of 100 feet. Now this number I forget. We're just going to say the number of seed spouts in that 15-foot drill is 24. I don't know if that's the right number.
Well, that'd be drill spacing.
Yeah, it's not spacing, the total number of spouts on that 15-foot drill.
Right.
So maybe we're just going to say it's 25. So in 100 feet, you need to collect 18.76 grams in order, and that when you do that 18.76 grams, that'll equal 30 pounds to the acre. How about that?
No drill is that accurate.
You're right, but that's as close as we can get. Now, the other comment to that is you won't never get the same exact mix of seeds in that 100 feet as the next 100 feet and the next 100 feet, right? But it's getting you in the ballpark. So if this was me, I would probably try to hit that 18.76 grams and then close it down just a tiny bit. I'd rather be a little thinner than I would run out at the end of the field.
I just want to throw in right here that if you guys ever get to the point where you're trying to calibrate your drills like something like this is the kind of stuff that I love doing. I would love to come out there and just catch seed for you and weigh it and then all that kind of jazz in a day if you guys are getting ready to do that kind of stuff. I've done it for CRP seedings, and I just think it's one of the funnest things to do. First of all, you're out in the field, which a lot of us NRCS folks don't get out in the field very much anymore. We seem to be stuck behind computers all the time. So if you guys ever get this and you need somebody or you want somebody to come out and help you catch grass, or not grassy, but just seed and weigh it, I'd love to do that for you guys.
Okay. Very good. And on this fact sheet, there's the handwritten method if you want to test it. So question.
Is this seed mix come mixed that way, or is it up to the individual to mix it?
Generally, when you buy it from a cover crop company, it'll come mixed this way. So that, of course, you pay for that a little bit, but that's, let's see. Oh, if I put in here acres, I'm just going to say 100 acres.
We can't see your screen anymore.
Oh, sorry. Now do you see it?
Yep.
So if I put in 100 acres in the spreadsheet, it'll tell me that I need 400 pounds of hairy vetch and 50 pounds of radish. So you could go to the seed company and just say, I need this many, and mix it yourself in your mix-all grinder. But if you're doing big acres, it's kind of nice to already have it mixed, and also to have your rhizobium inoculum put on your legumes. You guys want to build a warm season mix, something planted May 25th if you got irrigated systems. Is there any irrigators out there?
Yep. Seed the 1st of June right after a fall cereal grain hay.
Okay, so seed June 1st right after a small grain for hay. So I'm going to change out hairy vetch and put in a balanza clover. And I'm going to add a warm season species like mung bean. I'm going to take out spring barley, and I'm going to put in sorghum Sudan grass. I'm going to put in brown midrib sorghum Sudan grass. Do I have that listed any other way? Okay, here's sorghum Sudan grass, but I'm gonna make sure it's a BMR. I'm also gonna put in maybe a millet. I'm gonna put in a German millet. And now I'm gonna, I still like these brassicas for any mix. I'm gonna just look quick. Okay, I'm good with those. Broadleafs, I still love black oil sunflower. Maybe I'm gonna take out flax and I'm gonna put in Phacelia, and I'm gonna put in baldy safflower. So on all these these broadleaf ones, they're generally only put in at 1 pound to the acre. And because I'm going to plant a little later, I'm going to up my radish this time because maybe I have a more of a compaction relief problem. But the cool thing is these multi-species mixes will address every problem that you have. Nearly every problem. German millet, notice that it has 180,000 seeds per pound. So look, guys, I only need one. Sorghum Sudan is pretty good where it's at 4. You know what? I'm going to go to 5 on it. Maybe drop my oats to 3. So I'm at 32. What was my goal for irrigated? How many pounds was my goal for irrigated cover crops?
Never heard.
Never heard.
40.
40. 30 for dry land, 40 for irrigated. Mung bean, I'm going to go 3. And because I've never experienced with, I'm not experienced with faba bean, I'm going to drop it down to 3 because it's kind of an experimental basis. Now look at Balanza clover. How many seeds per pound in Balanza clover? A lot, 500,000. So look, guys, I only need 1 pound to the acre. Now, because Balanza has so many seeds, 500,000 in a pound, it's put my seeding rate at 1.5 million. Phacelia, I'm going to cut it down because look, it has 225,000. So I'm going to go a quarter on it. So this leaves me a little bit more room to add. So I'm going to go back up to 5 on oats and maybe 5 on triticale. So when you plant, after a small grain cutting and you get a frost, let's just say you get a frost September 20th, just out of the blue, your warm season grasses are done growing, right? Mm-hmm. But if you have cool season species, they'll keep growing. And here's another one. Here's a new trick that we've learned last couple of years. We're going to plant winter wheat in the summertime if you don't have it in your current crop rotation. And we're going to put 5 pounds of winter wheat in the mix. So look, I'm at 37 pounds to the acre, 1.4 million seeds per acre. And that's in, I might come down on Balanza clover, 0.75. 1.3 million, 37 pounds of seed to the acre. Sunflower, Phacelia, baldy, really good compaction relief on sunflower. If the sunflowers make a seed head, they'll be about the small dinner plate size. Generally, they'll eat the seed head and leave the stalk. And so that stalk is going to really help me cover the ground to prevent erosion. The grasses will really help with fibrous root systems and biomass yield. The legumes and brassicas will really help with nitrogen fixation and high quality feed for grazing. Phacelia is a tremendous pollinator and has a pretty good taproot on it. So there's kind of a Cadillac version. The gentleman that wanted to do this, if this, say, Marlon, this scares me. I'm not comfortable with this mix. Just tell me that, would you?
I'm fine with it.
Okay. If you weren't fine with it, I would take mung bean right out.
No, I hate it. I'm scared.
He hates it. He's scared. So what I got to do is I got to increase it. So if I take one out, I need to maybe put spring pea up to 8. You see what I did? I took one out, so I increased it. See, I'm at 38. I'm still in the ballpark. Let's say you call up your cover crop seed company and they don't have collards, or the company's out of collards. You can put kale in. So anyway, this is a very typical mix I've made on thousands of acres, trying to, and we didn't have as good a discussion, you never do in a training, checking the purposes. But this mix, a mix like this will fix almost every purpose you have in mind.
Question.
Go ahead.
Being a drylander, I don't expect you to go back to that dryland formula, but I would like to know that since that was spring seeded, and I would in the fall want to seed fall wheat into this ground, I'm not getting the winter soil stabilization that I hope to have by planting that fall mix or the spring mix. So what can I plant in the fall that will give me soil stabilization and ground cover?
Okay, so let's make a fall seeded mix. So I'm going to try Austrian winter pea, faba bean. Faba bean will overwinter. We're learning. I'm going to go hairy vetch, sorghum.
May I make a clarification or question? If Steve is talking about stubble, harvest wheat in the stubble over winter, or are you talking about co-seeding with the wheat? Because I have questions about both scenarios.
Well, the first crop is going to be into fallow ground, so there won't be any stubble.
Okay.
And so it'll be a September 20th planting, right?
Thereabouts.
Thereabouts. So we know all the warm season species won't go. We're not going to do winter wheat because that's probably in his rotation. But I am going to do winter triticale. And I'm not going to do oats because they won't survive the winter. I'm not
Marlon,
gonna do...
I have a question kind of along this, just kind of going along with what Steve is saying. Steve, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understood your question is, we've done our spring cover crop mix, we planted it, and then we're going in to plant our winter wheat, correct? And so we're going to plant our winter wheat in September, but we still are not going to have that soil protection in the winter. Was that what you're kind of asking, Steve?
Yes, more or less. After I've taken off my wheat crop, now I have stubble. How can I stabilize that soil and add nitrogen into that stubble ground for overwinter use? Maybe I've changed the game here a little bit, but
okay. So he's really looking for more of a winter cover crop mix.
Okay, I'm on track. I'm going to build him a winter cover crop mix. Hold with me for just a minute.
Do you see any weed or potential issues with contamination for like triticale or hairy vetch or whatever becoming a weed issue in wheat and etc.? I mean, if you're doing forage the next year, no problem. But if you're going into wheat,
if you're going into wheat, you just got to make sure those cover crops don't go to seed. So you got to plan your grazing or your termination so that they don't go to seed.
Okay,
But if you let winter triticale go to seed, you know,
it'll be a mess.
yeah, you're gonna have problems. But generally, we don't see very much problems with winter triticale becoming a weed, only if you let it go to seed. So here's my species that will overwinter: hairy vetch, Austrian winter pea, faba bean, winter triticale, and Siberian kale. And so I got to up these a little bit. 5, probably 15, 20. So there's a cover crop mix that would be planted in September, to be planted in September, and come springtime, late springtime, May or June, then you have an opportunity to cut it for hay or graze it. I would prefer to graze it, or you spray it out and just kill it and put it on the ground for residue. And that's a little high, 43 pounds. Maybe we drop peas to 10 and triticale to 15. So there's 33 pounds of cover crop mixed to the acre.
How much growing time do we need all those crops to establish for overwinter?
The same as winter wheat.
So some situations we don't get a fall rain, so you harvest your crop in August and etc. We don't get a fall rain until end of October.
Yeah, so then I'm probably going to take out some of these unknowns that I'm not very familiar with, or maybe I only put 0.5 pounds of faba bean in. You see what I mean? Maybe I can't risk 2 pounds of faba beans because I'm nervous they won't get established. But we've planted Austrian winter peas and hairy vetch the same time we've planted winter wheat. And, you know, if you're nervous, then you start off on small acreage until you can prove it. So don't do this on 7,000 acres. Maybe you do this on 40 acres your first year.
Would this particular mix make a good hay forage, baled hay the next year?
Yes, it would. And if I was going to turn this more into a hay, I would probably up this number to 30 pounds a trit. See, I'm at 46 pounds. So if I was going to push this system for hay, I would up my seeding rates a little bit. But see, I'm still at 750,000 seeds per acre. What do you normally plant your winter wheat at? How many pounds per acre?
70.
70 to 80.
80
So,
better.
70 to 80, that's what I heard. Was it
80 or better?
80 or better. So if you wanted to up your triticale, what that does is it puts pressure on these other species if you dominate it with triticale. You know, I wouldn't have heartburn of going 40 or 50, but my cover crop mix probably wouldn't go too much, or you will never see these other species in your mix.
Is that a generality for all of any kind of scenario? If you're making a hay out of it or intense grazing, your seeding rate is going to be a lot more than 30. 30 is more like if you're just going to spray it out for a little bit of residue cover.
No, in dry land, we've had a lot of 30 and 40 pounds per acre, because in a dry land scenario, the moisture you receive can't handle much more than that. So see my number, well, I'm at 60 total, but I'm at 900, almost 1 million seeds to the acre. So that's the equivalent of 100 pounds of wheat to the acre. See what I'm getting? So that's probably pushing it there on a dry land scenario.
Marlon, I have a question. There's been some guys in the state of Washington, dryland guys farther up north in the Douglas County area, I believe, who've been doing some companion cropping and really doing the companion cropping with the tiller radishes, seeding it in with their winter wheat when they go in and seed in the fall, August, September. Is there benefit to that? And are there other species other than the radishes? I think the reason they picked the radishes is because they winter kill out. So they're not getting, obviously, like you said, they're not getting the massive radish that you see the guy standing there in the cover crop picture with his,
right, this
2 foot long radish that's just massive, but they're still getting some benefit out of them. Have you guys experimented with that at all? Do you have any information on that? And what species, if you do, what species would you recommend guys to look at?
It doesn't matter the species, in my opinion, because they're going to winter kill in 45 days. So I don't think it's worth spending high dollar money on something that's going to kill in 45 days. I think what can happen if you get some moisture and you get those radishes to germinate, that's great. If it's a dry year, they may not germinate very well. But we've had a few guys plant 1 pound to the acre of radish with their wheat. And we don't have any research to back it up. Some guys, but the thing is, it's increasing a little bit of diversity, and it's giving you a taproot in a fibrous root system monoculture crop rotation.
Other than radish, is there anything else that a guy could put in as a companion crop that would have benefit to you? Is there any of the warm? I'm assuming you'd have to stay warm season so that they winter kill out, so that they're not competing come the next spring with your cash crop. But is there anything else that a guy could look at putting in there that would just winter kill on a freeze that would, like you said, increase diversity and improve soil health even in a short 45-day window?
Before you answer that, could I add?
Yes, there is.
If it did overwinter and then you sprayed it out in the spring with your herbicide, or this kind of goes back to my co-seeding of legumes with it, will they be any benefit to your wheat when you're fertilizing your wheat to actually get a wheat crop? Will your legumes not nodulate anything to support that?
Oh boy, thousands of questions, you guys. Very good. So the planting clovers with your wheat, we have a few guys nationwide starting to do that. One of them is Gabe Brown, who introduced it to me. For example, one of his crops, he plants oats, and he grows the tallest oat he can find, and he plants 3 different clovers the same time he plants his spring oats. And then when he combines, the header is above the small clovers. And then when he combines it, the clovers are released. Now, Gabe doesn't apply any nitrogen, but they will still fix some nitrogen, just not their maximum if you put the full fertility rate on. But I think what you do in that example is you do some test plots where you cut your fertilizer rate down 75% or 50% rate just on a strip, and see if you can see any difference. To the gentleman that asked about, remember that the warm season species, yes, they will winter kill, but you can't plant them in October, because if you get a freeze, it'll just kill the little seedling. And so generally you plant the cool season species, things that would overwinter, for example, would be a Siberian kale. And then come springtime, if you want to kill the kale out, you spray it with your broadleaf weed herbicide. People have planted turnips. They sometimes don't winter kill as easy as a radish. But sometimes an overwintering turnip can be a little hard to kill, because now it's 3 or 4 or 5 months old, and you got a little thicker leaf, tissue for that herbicide to get through. It's an old plant, right? It's 5 months old. sometimes it can be a little harder to kill. So that's why they like a radish, because it just winter kills. Some of the clovers that you could plant, they plant crimson clover or they plant Burmsing clover with the small grains at maybe just 1 or 2 pounds to the acre. These questions we don't have good answers for, guys, because we're just a bunch of individual farmers learning on our own. We don't have a lot of background research from the universities helping us out. And so, you know, this again, it goes to that, hey, here's my research demonstration field, 20 acres. I'm going to put Siberian kale and crimson and Burmsing clover in my wheat mix and see what it looks like. These are the same questions I get from producers who have been planting cover crops for 10 years. Now they want to start interseeding some of these cover crops with their other crops. And most of our guys that do this interseeding, they may be spraying a pre-plant glyphosate product when they plant, before they plant the wheat, and then they're not spraying with broadleaf herbicide in, you know, late April or 1st of May. Some guys, if you spray it, maybe it'll kill it and set it back. You know, the cover crop, if you want to kill it. But if it's not in the way of your combine header, you probably don't need to kill it.
Our concern usually is with weeds such as just small broadleaf annuals, morning glory, Candida thistle, some knapweeds and that type of thing. And so just managing those is the goal.
Yeah, and so you got to spray the field, right? And so if you spray the field, you'll kill your kale, crimson clover and Burmsing clover, but at least it'll have an opportunity to grow late in the fall and some in the spring before you spray your herbicide.
There's some people here that are seeding, well, after Thanksgiving or way late into this year. If one were to seed with the wheat, the warm season seeds, will they lay dormant until ground temperature brings them awake?
Probably not, because they haven't evolved to be planted like that. So my guess is they will not survive. They don't have this hard seed coat mechanism like a small grain or a legume. So my guess is no, but I don't know anybody that's done that. We have planted a few dormant seeding cover crops once or twice, and we didn't have success with it, but I still think we just, you know, we were unlucky. But warm season species is probably not going to work for you.
You mentioned earlier about another awesome calculator. I'm not sure if you were implying your own or another one.
Oh, another one. I have it here.
Because I've used that one and I had some questions on, I've gone through that, and then I actually have 2 bags of seed, hopefully to seed this next week from them. And what the calculator said versus what the guys on the phone said and what I have are 2 separate things. And so.
Yes. So this is a cover crop calculator from a company in Nebraska called greencoverseed.com, and they'll ship cover crop seed anywhere in the USA. So just like my spreadsheet, guess what? I took all the information I could out of this cover crop calculator and put it in mine. So I'm just throwing in a couple goals or resource concerns they want to achieve, and you have to do that or it won't go. So like the gentleman was saying, you can make the cover crop calculator plan your mix, or you can do it yourself. And so when I learned to build a cover crop mix, I wanted to see how the cover crop calculator built their mix. And Green Cover Seed and Marlon Winger's philosophy come from the North Dakota philosophy of how to build a cover crop mix. So if you wanted to build let's just build oh, I didn't tell it when I was going to plant this mix, I don't think.
Real quick, Marlon, just because of time, there's a couple of questions and I don't know how much time people have, so maybe we could just address those real quick. It looks like in the chat, there was a gentleman who was asking if there's a link to get a copy of that Excel spreadsheet.
I'll give you the phone number, 1-800-ANGEL.
I thought that you might be able to send me that. Okay. And maybe you already did. So I can get that to anybody who needs it. And then there was also, I didn't catch what cover crop blend Noah used, but there is a question about what the exact cover crop blend. Did you guys remember what he used?
He didn't say, but I saw things like beardless triticale, oats. I saw Facilia. I saw common vetch. I saw purple top turnip.
Okay. All right. I think that's all we had. So thank you, Marlon. You can go ahead and continue.
Hey, and if you guys need to jump off, feel free to jump off. So here's the cover crop mix. This calculator lists them by excellent, good, marginal, and risky for the scenario I built. And so, for example, here's the other thing I like about this company is unique is you can see that common vetch costs $1.15 a pound, where woolly pod vetch costs $2 a pound. So I'm gonna build a simple mix here. I'm gonna do a grain sorghum wildlife habitat blend because it's dirt cheap, 65 cents. Look at sedan grass, 80 cents. Purple top turnips, $1, 65. Impact forage collards. I'm gonna put a spring oat in. Maybe I'm gonna put in Goliath oat, and I'm gonna put in a nitro radish and black oil sunflower. I'm just going to add these to the mix. And it will automatically calculate a seeding rate for you. And the other thing that's really cool for my grazing goal, it gave me 98%. Drought tolerance 65, frost tolerance 80%, winter hardiness 46. I didn't spend the time to really flesh out my but it gives you the percent of your goal that you're gonna theoretically meet. So it's gonna give me I'm just looking out here. Seeds, 572,000 seeds per acre. Just quickly, it was a little lower, 20.5 pounds per acre. cost is $16.22 an acre, just for that example mix. Now, I went through that really quick just to kind of show you how it calculated. Here's the pounds per acre. But notice the Marlon Winger philosophy, 1, 1, 1, 1, 12, 1, 3. See what I mean?
So question, Marlon, I went through that thing and I think I ended up with like 32 pounds an acre and about $20 an acre in cost. And then I talked to the guys, Dean there in Nebraska, and then he sent me to Brad McIntyre there in Idaho. And I ended up with what they said to do is 80 pounds an acre of seed costing about $50 an acre.
And was you going to cut it for hay or what?
Yes. Was the
Yeah,
intent.
so a hay mix is going to be a little different because you want to maximize your tonnage versus a grazing mix or a just a resource concern mix. So when you plan to cut hay, you're gonna be higher seeding rates,
Okay.
or you're not gonna get no bales coming out at the baler, right? You can't plant 20 pounds of wheat and get very much hay coming out. See what I mean?
Yep.
So they're nearly planting a full seeding rate. But one of the challenges with these big heavy seeding rates, if you put on, I'm going to turn this off. If you put in your oats, 65 pounds, when you go really strong in an oat, you may not even see these collards or turnips because it'll be too competitive. It just kind of chokes. It's kind of like playing basketball with your little brother when you were 15 and he was 7. It's like he has no chance. But anyway, so did you see where I just clicked that on and off up here?
Yes.
So if I wanted more grain sorghum, I can put 5 in, and maybe I'm going to cut this oat down to 25. So you can do that, and it'll still pop you out here a cost estimate. And they're going to inoculate the seed for you. So then the next thing you do is you got to send this off to the company, and they'll give you a quote for what it'll cost to ship it to you. Now, what we do in Wyoming is we'll have the farmers fill out this. They'll get a bid from Green Cover Seed, and they also send the mix to their local seed company and get a local price for it. Because I love these Green Cover Seed guys. They're like family to me. But really, I want to try to promote the cover crop industry in Wyoming, get some of these seed companies moving along, right? Same thing in Washington.
For the benefit of everyone on the call, that when I talked to these guys, I got shunted to Brad McIntyre, which is in the Caldwell area. And he is hoping this fall to have a mixing ability to be able to ship it out of Caldwell versus currently mine came out of Nebraska, which cost a lot in shipping. And so he's hoping to have that ability to be that many hours closer to us, but he is the only thing for them in Washington, Oregon, or Idaho.
For them.
Nevada. Yeah.
For green cover.
Yeah.
There are other cover crop companies in the West, besides green cover, but nobody has a calculator. I just love learning to build a cover crop mix with this. The other thing that these guys have is you can go here to their seeds column, their seed tab, And if you don't know about black oats, for example, you can just click on it. It gives you they share a video. They have some advantages, uses, disadvantages, if any, planting. So it's kind of a library. They've really spent a lot of time in teaching themselves about cover crops. You can go to legumes, look up Balanza clover. So if you're buying this for your little garden project, a pound of Balanza clover is going to cost you $6 a pound, right? But if you put in 500, it's $2.25. Whoop. It's $2.25. Now, yeah. Other questions? We're going way over time, Angel.
Yep. I think if there's no more questions, we will probably go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, Marlon. That was extremely helpful. Really good conversation happening there. That smart mix calculator is amazing. You all should try it. Thank you to both Justin and Marlon for your presentations today. In the follow-up email after the webinar, we will have contact information for both Justin and Marlon. So if you guys have any more questions about anything, you can reach out to them. You can reach out to me. We're all here for you. I didn't mention it before. The conservation districts are in the process of developing a pilot program. So we really hope to get some pilot projects out on the ground here in the next year or so in regards to soil health, possibly cover crops. So I really encourage you to fill out the post-webinar survey because there are specific questions in there that really pertain to future pilot projects, what you're interested in, what your land looks like, if you have livestock. We're really digging into all that stuff to figure out what kind of funding is available to us in the future to help out anybody who's looking to do these projects. So again, thank you so much. And I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. So I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us here.